Thank you to those of you who joined us this morning for the MND Association webinar. We'll be starting shortly. If I can just please ask everyone to remain muted and have your cameras turned off. The webinar will be recorded and available on our website in due course for anyone to rewatch it, or if you have to leave early today. I'm just going to hand over now to Jenny, who is going to start the session, and then hand over to Jennifer. Thank you.
Thanks, Sam. Hello, everybody. Thank you for coming today. My name is Jenny Bedford. I'm Head of Partnerships, Education and Information at the MND Association. And just quickly, that the aim of this webinar is to support health and social care professionals with a particular focus on SLTs who may be new to working with people with MND, preparing for their first few sessions with a person with MND and their family. And our aim is that by the end of the session, you'll have an understanding of what you need to know to feel well informed before initial visit or visits, considered how best to use person-centered care and what needs to be covered early and how to broach those difficult topics that you'll come across. You'll have explored some of the questions you may be asked by the person in your care and considered the role of the MDT and how your local setup will influence individual roles and responsibilities. And we hope you'll increase your confidence in your ability to work with people living with MND. So I'm delighted to introduce our presenter for today. It's Jennifer Benson. Jennifer is an independent speech and language therapist, but she has extensive experience of working with people living with MND. So without further ado, over to you, Jen.
Thanks, Jenny. Good morning, everybody. This is where we get to the tricky bit and have to share the screen, so just cross your fingers for me now. There we are. That's good. Hopefully everybody can see me. That's great. Okay, so thank you very much, everybody, for coming. It's lovely to see so many people attending and to get this opportunity to talk about what we're doing with our patients with MND. So just before we start, this is where it's not going to play. There we go. That's better. So what I'd like to do really is just to gauge a little bit about how people are feeling about working with people with MND. Just watching the chat as you were all coming in there, it looks as though we've probably got varying levels of experience. So what we'd like to invite you to do is just to give us one word about how you feel about working with people with MND.
If you see on the screen now, there is a link and a code to go on to our Menti app. So please do go on and put in your thoughts so Jen can see them and they can start building.
Fantastic. Thank you, Lisa. Sam. Thank you, Sam. So I'll just tell you a little bit about myself as well. As Jenny said, I've over 20 years experience working with MND, 20 plus within the NHS, and then I left the NHS and have been working for about 2.5–3 years privately by myself, and still getting lots of experience with people with MND, which is great. For me, it's become one of my favourite client groups to work with. Very challenging, but definitely a group that's incredibly rewarding to work with, not least because I've met some fantastic, incredible, strong people through the years and been able to help them. And that, I think, is what it's all about for us as professionals. So just looking at some of the words that are coming up here, apprehensive, the big one in the middle, I think that's a really common feeling that people feel apprehensive about working with MND. It's a challenging environment. Challenging's popping up there as well. What else have we getting coming up? All keeps changing. Apprehensive, inexperienced. Yeah, there's a few people coming up with inexperienced there. That's really good to see that. Hopefully you're in the right place today so that we can start to make you feel a little bit more comfortable about that. Privilege, just spotted privilege down the side there. That's a great one to see. I definitely feel privileged to work with people with MND. And I think I learn from every single person I meet with MND, because everybody has something different to bring to the table, something different to challenge us as professionals, and something different that they need from us. So I think privileged is a really key word. Anything else that's coming up there? Rewarding, yeah, that fits in with the privileged one really nicely. Interesting, yeah, it's a fascinating topic, fascinating condition with different ramifications for everybody. So I think that just comes up all the time. Exhausted emotionally, that's a little one down there that I just want to pick up on. I think that can happen to a lot of people who are working with MND. It is emotional, it is challenging from that perspective, and looking after yourself is going to be really key when you do work with MND. Any more for any more? That's changing again. So we've got an unsure down the side. We've got quite a big nervous. Unequipped, there's another one. Daunting, yeah, definitely daunting. You don't quite know what you're going to get, I think, when you meet somebody with MND. So I think daunting is a good word to reflect that. Intense, I can just see in a little one there. That might move again now. It can be very intense. It absolutely can. Okay. Oh, well, thank you for everybody for sharing that. That's absolutely great. What I think I'd like to say is that today we want to be a really safe space to discuss these kinds of issues. So this is a place for us to learn from each other. So I'm hoping that this helps everybody to feel that they can share and that they can put comments in the chat, and we can pick up on those as we get towards the end of the presentation. Okay. Okay, so hopefully now we're going to see a little video clip. So Lynn is my expert here. Lynn is a lady who I worked with a few years ago with MND. And Lynn can tell you her story, a little bit of her story in her own words. This is a little clip that the Royal College of Speech and Language Therapists put together for me last year for MND Awareness Day. So have a look at Lynn and see what you think. Ready to play, Sam? There's no sound on the video, it's just to read. Okay, so thank you to Lynn for setting the scene for us there. So Lynn was a patient that I learned a lot from. Lynn and I spent a lot of time together, so it's really good to see her words there and see what some of her experiences were. Lynn gave me lots of fantastic insights into MND and her experiences with it, so I'm hoping that that's just set the scene a little bit for us there. Okay, so my work with people with MND is all in the community. So what I'm really talking about is home visit situations here. But I do appreciate that lots of you are also seeing people in outpatient clinics, on hospital wards, and in various other situations and settings. So I'm hoping that this will apply to everybody, regardless of where you're seeing your people with MND. So the first thing I wanted to think about was a scenario for your first visit. What are you going to walk into? So you might have some of this information from your referral, if you're lucky enough to get a referral letter, or you might know very little about what you're walking into in your first visit. So just to think through some of those situations where you might find yourself going through that doorway. So the first set of patients that you might see are those who've just been diagnosed. So they might have had a good diagnosis experience, or they might have had a bad diagnosis experience. I still hear both on a regular basis. So I think it's good to be prepared for both of those, just in case that's what comes up. So some people might feel that they were really well supported through that diagnosis, and some people have a less good story. You might see somebody who's been recently diagnosed, but is a little bit further through their journey, who's been well supported and is starting to come to terms with things. And they might be at a point where they're ready to find out a little bit more information about something, or they might not. Everyone's different. You might see someone who was diagnosed some time ago. So, for example, a patient with PLS, primary lateral sclerosis, who might have been diagnosed a while ago and has been living with their MND for quite some time. And they might be the patient who wants something very specific from you. And an example of that recently for me has been a patient with PLS who was diagnosed probably about 6 years ago and has very recently just started to have some changes to his voice and wanted to talk about voice banking. So that was a very different type of visit, to go and do something that was very functional compared to some of those earlier ones where there's a lot more discussion-based session needed. You might also see someone who's had investigations or is having investigations but hasn't yet been diagnosed. So they're still in the what if category. What if I have MND? What if? What if? And that can be quite difficult to have some of those conversations with people, particularly if you can see that it looks likely that they will get that diagnosis, but actually nobody has been able to give them to that because they've not reached that point in their journey yet. And the last category of people are really those ones who are symptomatic, and you can see that they're symptomatic, but they have no idea and are not aware of the possibility of MND as a diagnosis. And I think as speech and language therapists, we see quite a lot of those patients. Sometimes they're the ones that come down the voice clinic route. Sometimes they're that very woolly letter from the GP that says this person's speech is slurred. Please, can you go and see them? And I think particularly during the pandemic, when less people have seen less people, we have been picking up on quite a lot of people that way. So just really to flag up the red flag toolkit that the MND Association have produced, and to make sure that everybody's aware of that, so that if you are seeing people who haven't had a diagnosis but you think may well need a referral to neurology, that you can use that tool in order to flag up your concerns to the GP and initiate that urgent neurology referral. Okay. So I think the first thing that's really critically important is to be able to explain to somebody what MND is. I think you need to have a good understanding of this yourself in order to be able to explain it to somebody else. And it can be one of the key things that you first need to have a discussion with somebody about when you first meet them. So people might be wanting to know what MND is, how it's diagnosed, what's happening in the brain, and various other questions. So for me, I feel like I have a script of how I'm explaining this to people, having done it lots of times. So to have your script ready to be able to explain what MND is, I think is a really critical first step. So what I'd like to do is just invite everyone just to take a few minutes and have a little think about what your script is for explaining MND. And if you don't know at this point in time, that's okay, but just start to have a think through about what sort of things you might want to say. And if anybody would like to share anything in the comments with us, then please do, and we'll pick up on that once you've had a few minutes to think. Are we getting any comments through, Jenny?
We are. So I've had somebody sort of saying that they meet patients a little bit further down the line, so they've got that information already.
Okay, that's good.
And another point saying just finding out what somebody understands already before you launch into your script.
Yes, definitely. I'm coming on to that kind of angle of things really soon,
Yeah.
making sure that we're following the patient's agenda. So yeah, those are really relevant points.
Absolutely. Asking how somebody feels about how they're feeling about the diagnosis.
Yeah, good open question to start you off, definitely.
Yeah, asking them what they want to know. I think that's a good one as well.
Definitely critical.
Yeah, being led by the person. Well, I think we're all saying the same thing about this sort of person-centeredness.
That's good. That's what we want to hear. That's all good.
Yeah.
I think the fact that everybody is reflecting that back here just shows how critical it is that we're following that person's agenda, and I'm going to come on to that in a minute.
Absolutely. An indication here about psychological distress someone might be having from a diagnosis, to being aware of that.
Absolutely. And I think that leads on to whether people have actually heard very much of the diagnosis. And I think that people don't necessarily hear what they're told when it is very psychologically distressing. Mm-hmm. And that, I think, is why you need to be able to explain it to people.
Yeah, absolutely. Here, an interesting one, finding out what people looked up themselves. So there's that kind of Google thing that people do.
Dr. Google.
And indicating it's a progressive disease, so understanding that affects muscle and movement.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So this is about you being informed to be able to explain this before you've even got through the door. So that's where I'm going with this, really, is to make sure that you understand MND in case you are then in that situation where you do have to explain it to somebody once you get through the door, if they haven't heard that information at diagnosis or they haven't understood it.
Mm-hmm. And Sam's posting some links in the chat here, so through to the association information that can help you get up to speed about things like that.
Yeah, so there's so much good information on the association website. So the explanations are there, both in lay terms for the people living with MND, but also for the professionals. So it's good to have a read of both, so that helps to inform you what your script is going to be if you are in the situation where you need to explain. Okay, shall we move on?
Yep.
Okay. So, should I need to use it? My script really goes something like this. So MND is a condition that affects your brain and gets worse over time. The motor neurons die so that the messages can't get to the muscles, and this causes the muscles to weaken and to get smaller and eventually to stop working. So some types of MND start with changes to the arms and legs, and some start with changes to speech and swallowing, and that's what we call bulbar. I think it's good to acknowledge that it's a diagnosis of exclusion. So usually the neurologist is looking at all of the other things that it could be before giving a diagnosis of MND, because there is no definitive test that says, yes, this is MND. And that everyone is different. Everyone's MND is different. And I think that's something that I will keep coming back to, and something that we definitely see the more people with MND that we work with. So that's the kind of thing that I would have in my mind to want to be able to explain if that's where the conversation takes us. So remember, this is you being prepared before you've got to the patient. So the other thing I would suggest that you're prepared with before you go is to have an overview of research. And again, this is not a suggestion that you should know every single thing about every single research project that's going on, but to have a general idea of what's going on nationally with research trials is a good place to be. It's good to know where to direct people to if they do bring up research. So whether that's their MND nurse, their consultant, their care centre, there'll be lots of sources of information about research, but just to have that background knowledge. Be aware that people do bring up some really random treatments that they've found on the internet, Dr. Google, yes again, and just think about how you would want to deal with that if people bring up something that you've never come across before. And I think, again, referring them back to their medical team is probably the best way to do that. And the way I keep up with research is to sign up for the MND Association's research newsletter, and that pops into your inbox and gives you a really good overview of everything that's going on in the research world. And I also like Twitter for that reason too. I find it a really convenient way of just following everything that's going on, and it fits into working life really quite nicely. So again, not saying that you need to have an in-depth knowledge of research, but just to have that overview, because people do bring it up on a regular basis, and it's good to be able to have a response. Okay, so this is, I think, what some of our comments are already started to bring up, which is fantastic. So your agenda versus their agenda. So it's about, for me, it's about knowing what information you need to gather and how you then work that in to what the patient wants to know and needs to know. So it's absolutely critical to follow the patient's agenda and the family's agenda and whoever is with them at the time, and to allow them to ask you those questions at their pace. So as somebody's already commented, starting the conversation with open questions, something like, how are you feeling? How are you feeling about your diagnosis? A really good starting point. And then to work your agenda and your questions in around their questions so that you have a conversation. So for example, as a speech and language therapist, I'm going to want to know a full case history of everything that's gone on. I'm going to want to know whether they're having any difficulties swallowing, what sort of difficulties they are, have they lost weight, have they had any chest infections, etc., etc. I'm going to want to know how they're communicating, how's their speech doing, is that fatiguing, is it changing, can they talk on the phone? Do they use a smartphone? Do they use a computer? That's going to be really important information for me down the line when we come to look at AAC. Are they dysarthric? Are they losing intelligibility? Do we need to get in there quick with some discussions about strategies and some alternative communication strategies? But by working my agenda into their agenda and their conversation, it allows the person with MND to feel that they're taking responsibility, they're taking ownership for what they need to know. And actually, by talking to them and listening to them, you're going to find out so much more information. And listening well allows you to gather lots and lots of really useful and good information about all of the things that are on your agenda by following their agenda. And I think if people feel listened to, they're just going to give you so much more information than if you sit with your checklist and sit ticking the boxes. So it's really critical to follow that person's agenda. I think a good example of that for me recently is I'm working with a lady who was a teacher in a special school that specialised in communication aid provision. Now, she probably knows way more about AAC than I do, and she's great, but she can't apply that to her own situation at all. But by finding that out about her and finding out what her knowledge base is, it allows us to have that shared terminology so that we can then apply her knowledge to our discussions about AAC, which is a little bit further down the line than the initial session. But just to be able to take what you know from somebody, to get that shared ground and that shared terminology is really important. And I think never underestimate what you give by just listening and by giving that safe space to people to be able to explore what they're feeling, what they want to know, what they need to know, and to be able to take that at their pace is absolutely critical. And I think allowing that time and allowing that listening space is the most important thing that we can do as health professionals. Okay, so I just wanted to talk a little bit about difficult questions, and I sometimes call these doorstep questions as well. And some of the things that we might get asked when we're there that can't always be the easiest questions to answer. The reason I've called them doorstep questions is because, again, quite often find that very often it's the relative who will follow me to the door. At the moment, they quite like to come to the car while you're taking all your PPE off. And that gives them the opportunity to ask questions away from the person with MND. And I think just to realise that people may be accepting things at a different pace is really important. The relative may well be accepting things very differently to the person with MND and has been put in that support role as well. So to be able to find the time can be quite challenging to talk to people separately. And that, I think, is why questions do tend to happen on the doorstep. So this is just a selection of things that I think I've been asked recently. So again, I'd just like to invite you to take a few minutes just to see what you think some of the answers to these questions might be. and pop a few things in the chat function if you feel like you are happy to share, and then we can just have a few discussions about what some of the answers might be for you as a health professional. And again, it's about being prepared yourself for things that might come up so that you know what you might say if that comes to you.
And a comment in the chat, Jen, living with uncertainty is hard.
Oh yes, definitely. Definitely. And I think that's really critical for some of those patients who don't have a diagnosis yet, but may well have MND, as well as for the patients who don't really know what's going to happen to them. So I think trying to give that information as much as you can do whilst acknowledging that everybody's different is really critical.
And again, just echoing what you're saying, every case is individual, preparation is key. Being honest and transparent.
Yes.
Gauging resilience and acceptance levels.
Yeah.
Important to answer questions, not dodge them, answer them honestly and sensitively.
Absolutely.
And the importance of holistic care, exploring advanced care planning.
Yeah, although that might come a little bit further down the line, but it's good to have that in the back of your mind as something that will need to be explored.
Reiterating that everyone's different, so not everyone's MND will be different, not the same.
Absolutely. I think that's a real go-to for me, and we know that it's true. And yeah, I think we'll know from seeing so many different people that everyone's MND is different, and I think acknowledging that is really important. Well, there's the uncertainty element with it, but it is important to acknowledge that everybody's MND is different.
A question here, if a condition is developing rapidly, how do you balance the following the person's agenda with the need for the person to receive information that's time sensitive? I'm sure you'll come on to that.
Yeah, I am coming on to that. Yeah. I think it's tricky. I'll come to that when I get to it, if that's okay.
Acknowledging distress.
Yes.
Someone's noted here, I've had a lot of patients referring back to Rob Burrow. Interestingly, the question you put on the number 7.
Absolutely. I think he's been on the news so much recently that he's become a real poster for living with MND.
Honesty and empathy, the themes are coming through.
Yeah. And I think if you demonstrate honesty and empathy, you really can't go wrong. I think it's absolutely critical. And I think gentle honesty is what I've written down in my notes here, gentle honesty. So you don't need to have all of the answers. And probably the extent to which you feel able to answer these questions depends on your level of experience and how many people you've talked to in these scenarios before, and is something that definitely develops the more patients you come into contact with. But you absolutely don't have to have all of the answers. It is providing that safe space to talk and to reflect back to people, to demonstrate your empathy, that's the most critical part of it, I think.
A question here for you, Jenny. I don't know if you want to take it now or you're going to cover it later, but how would you personally manage it if the carer wants to know more than the patient?
Oh, I think it depends. I think it depends on the situation, doesn't it? I think you have to be really sensitive to both sets of needs. I think if you're getting a message from the patient that they really don't want to know more, but the carer is pushing it to find out more information, I think it's completely appropriate to say to the carer, actually, I don't think we should discuss this now. However, let's take time out, either go to a different room if you feel that's appropriate during that time, refer them on elsewhere to have a discussion if you feel that's the most appropriate thing to do. But to acknowledge to both parties that their needs might be different from each other, and that it's important to try and manage everybody's needs as sensitively as we can do. And also that it's not just one session, is it? This might be the first time that you've met this person, but there are going to be a lot more sessions and a lot more professionals involved. So I think to be able to point out that there are going to be lots of opportunities to ask the different questions is really critical as well. And to acknowledge that people's needs are different. I think that's the key thing.
Another comment here that difficult questions can provide an opportunity for referring on to other services, such as palliative care.
Definitely. I'm coming on to that later too. Yes, our MDT is one of the most critically important things for us to have, and I will be talking about that later. So just a few answers to the questions. And again, there's no right or wrong. There's no definitive answers. But the how long have I got is a question that does seem to come up quite regularly. And I think the gentle honesty is really important. People do want to know the answers to the questions. And that's important, that that is what you give them. For that one, I tend to go with the 2 to 5 years approach. We know that 2 to 5 years is the average from onset of symptoms. I think that very often starts people talking about how their symptoms started, what they first started to notice, and being able to tell their story from that perspective as well. So it can be quite a useful question that goes in that direction as well. But making sure that you've got that gentle honesty is really key. I went to an end-of-life care course a good few years ago now that was very cancer focused, and they talked about how doctors stopped giving people a how long have I got answer in terms of time, because what they were finding was that if they told somebody they only had 6 months to live and then they went on beyond that 6 months, they didn't know what to do with themselves because they'd got it in their minds that 6 months was all they had. So they did everything that they needed to do in that 6 months and then didn't know what to do afterwards. And that really stayed with me. And I don't think that any of us would be in a position where we were going to say that to someone, but I think it just reinforces how important it is to have that honest conversation, but that actually none of us know because everyone is different. The what's going to happen to me is a really broad question. And again, that's something that has been said to me many times, what's going to happen to me? And for me, that feels like an opportunity to promote living with MND rather than dying from it. And again, people will accept that in their own time, but most people do, I think, eventually come to a point where they do accept that they can live with MND. And although all of these things are going to change for them, they can still have a life and still have a happy life and still make the most of life whilst they have it. I think that's related to the next one as well. Will I lose my speech, swallowing, hands, walking, whatever else? Again, I think sometimes people don't fully understand the process of MND and don't understand how it's going to happen. So some people think that they're just going to wake up tomorrow and not be able to talk, or wake up tomorrow and not be able to walk. And although we do see some people who change very rapidly, it's very rarely as rapid as that. And I think giving that reassurance can be really helpful. How will I die? The most recent one I had for this is my gentleman who likes to come to the car with me to talk about his partner whilst I take my PPE off. And he said to me, how's she going to die? And the answer to that is respiratory failure. You're going to die from respiratory failure. And I think the palliative care people who are in this audience will answer that one better than I can. But I think the role for us as AHPs in that question is to be able to say that death is well managed, that death is peaceful, that death is not painful, and that death can be a good death, and that there are lots of services available to support that, and that those services will come into play when they're needed, and to give that reassurance. Similar with, will I suffocate? No, you won't. Will I choke? Well, we hope not. As part of what we do in speech and language therapy, we'll be discussing your swallowing, we'll be looking at risk assessment, risk management, and together between us, we'll be coming to those conclusions about what things to eat and drink and what things not to eat and drink. So we don't want you to choke, and that's what we'll be trying to manage. And yeah, will I be like Stephen Hawking, Rob Burrow, lots of other people? I think Rob Burrow is a real key one at the moment. And again, I think the answer to that comes back to everyone is different. You are going to deteriorate, your MND is going to progress, but you won't be like anybody else because you're you living with your MND, and that will be be how it is for you as an individual. Okay, so things to cover early. And again, this comes back to a comment that was just made. So for me, what I like to cover early as my number one on my list is voice banking. And I could talk a lot about voice banking, which I'm not going to today. But voice banking is absolutely critical to be able to introduce and to make sure that that referral to speech and language therapy has gone in to enable people to voice bank whilst they still have the voice to do it. It's also important to talk about message banking alongside voice banking, and also any legacy messages, legacy videos that people might want to make whilst they still have their own voice. The benefit of voice banking is really giving people the element of control, and that is something that comes back to us time and time again, is that people feel like they want to do something, they want to be in control, and I'm going to cover this in a minute too, but to be able to do something that's very practical can make people feel like they're beating the MND, can make them feel like they've got something very focused that they can do that's very positive in a time when everything else is very negative. So for the speech and language therapists there, Richard Cave does some great training. So if you haven't done that yet, please do get yourselves onto Richard's training, find out more about voice banking, get your own voice banked so that you've got a voice ready to demonstrate. There's also lots of information on the association website and also on the RCSLT website about voice banking, but please do feel free to ask me any questions about that, because it's my pet subject, really. PEGs and non-oral nutrition. Now, some people might say that's a really strange thing to talk about in your first session or your first few sessions. And I'm not suggesting that it's something that you want to go into in massive depth. I'm not suggesting that you need to talk about all of the pros and cons and getting people to a point where they're ready to make that decision. But the reason I've put this down is that certainly locally to me, I tend to find that some of the neurologists and some of the respiratory physicians want to push this decision with people quite early on. So I like to get in there first to warn them really that that decision is something that they will need to consider fairly quickly. I think it's important to emphasize choice with that, and that nobody has to have a PEG or whatever other form of non-oral nutrition that they might be offered. And I also think it's critical to dispel some of the myths if that's where the conversation takes you. So again, the belief that you can't have anything orally if you've got that PEG in is one that comes up time and time again. So just really to put that agenda out there so that people have the opportunity to think about it before they're perhaps confronted a little bit with that decision in a clinic situation. So for me, just bringing that up, mentioning that you're going to have to make a decision about this at some point. There's lots of information out there to support you and lots of information to help you with that decision, but it is one that you'll need to think about. And again, referring people onto the association website to look at some of that information as and when they're ready to do. And I think that's the really nice thing about the information being there online, is that people can look at it at their own pace when they're ready to do it. And then they can come up with the questions that they want answered as a result of doing that. The other thing that I do feel is worth mentioning early is getting your affairs in order. And again, you have to take it at the pace that people want to talk about it, but just to mention that it's good to have a will and it's good to have that lasting power of attorney documentation in place now. And that may well take you down the advanced care planning route. And again, sometimes people want to talk about things really early that you wouldn't think that they did want to talk about, but because you're following that person's agenda, that's what's really critical to follow through. So you may be in a situation where you're talking about advanced care planning, about what people want. And you may also end up talking about funerals, which is not something you'd think that you want to talk about in your first session with someone with MND. And it's not something that I would advocate that you're raising in your first session with someone with MND, but just to have that in the back of your mind in case that's what's on that person's agenda, that's what's in that person's mind that day when you have gone, is really important to be able to answer those questions if you need to do so. Okay. So know your MDT. I think that is absolutely critical. Hopefully nobody works in a silo. Hopefully everybody works within an MDT, and certainly when you work with people with MND, you will need to be part of an MDT. It's critical to know where that MDT is. So you might be co-located, you might be in completely different parts of a city, a town, a hospital, but it's really important to know where those people sit so that you can refer on to them. And also so that you're talking to them about the people in your care and solving problems as they come up, which they inevitably do. It's good to check with the patient that they have been referred to the different members of the MDT, and to get permission and to send those referrals off if they haven't been referred. And I think knowing that that MDT is there is really important in terms of people forming their support network and knowing who will be there to help them when things change and when problems arise for them, and also who's there to support discussions about future care and future management. So know where your MDT is and make sure that you've referred on if you need to. Just a little word about positivity and control. Positivity in terms of trying to inject some positivity for that person with MND, because they may be feeling that everything is absolutely negative and absolutely hopeless. So just thinking about how you bring that positivity into your session when you meet your person with MND. So for me, it's about being able to emphasize living with MND and not dying from it, taking each day as it comes. And again, those are things that have been fed back to me very many times by people with MND. And I think it's good to be able to reflect that back, that that's what other people have told you has been significant for them. People very often ask what they can do, and it's good to know about the role of exercise within your professional remit. So as speech and language therapists, exercise is something that we don't tend to recommend. And the reason for that being that if you need to use your muscles to speak and you need to use your muscles for swallowing, you're exercising them anyway. So we don't want to fatigue those muscles any further so that you can't speak and you can't swallow. Having said that, people very often want to feel that they're doing something, that they want to beat the disease, that they want to get on top of it, that they want to get control of it. So it's important to be able to answer that question of what can I do with things that are relevant within your remit. So voice banking, again, is really critical in terms of a practical, a positive thing that people can do, which distracts in a way, I think, from some of those negatives and gives them something really, really practical and functional to focus on. Just another word for the SLTs as well, looking at the papers on EMST, expiratory muscle strength training. There's lots of good research articles have come out about that recently, and it's definitely good to be considering that as something that you can give people as something practical and functional to be able to do. So definitely worth having a look at that one. It's good to know what support's available. Form those support networks within the MDT and make sure that the person living with MND is aware of those support networks. And I always like to talk about control, and it's going to get busy. I think I say that to so many people, because when you do have that big MDT, it's a real positive. It's good to know that support network is there. But when there are lots and lots of different professionals going in, lots of hospital appointments potentially happening, it can get really busy for people. And I think sometimes they can feel that their life has just been overtaken by professionals and by professionals visiting them and by going to hospital appointments. So they don't actually have time to enjoy life and appreciate life. So I do always tend to say to people that if enough's enough, if you need a break from the professionals, if you need to stop for a bit, then that's important that you say that and you take control over that decision and you get what you need and what you want from that MDT and from everybody who's there to support you. Because at the end of the day, you're in charge of you and you make the decisions about you. And that's that's how I try and get that across to people, and I'm sure people will have lots of other ways that they've contributed to that kind of discussion as well. So just a few final bits really. So look after yourself, and I think that's really critical. Make sure that you do look after yourself, that you've got supervision in place. Lots of these situations are very emotional, very in-depth, exhausting at times, and can trigger all kinds of different feelings in you, and trigger things that have you've experienced yourself in your life that can be really quite difficult to deal with. So looking after yourself is critical and means that you're better able to look after the people that you're caring for. Use the AHP competencies framework to support your practice. For anyone who hasn't seen that, it covers speech and language therapists, dietitians, physiotherapists and occupational therapists, and sets out a big list of competencies, both for general neurology, but also with a section dedicated to MND, for things that you need to know, things that you need to be able to evidence as you progress through your career. And that's a really good checklist for making sure that you're covering lots of different areas in your preparation before you go and see someone, and to support your practice right the way through. Refer to the NICE guideline. It's really good. It's really helpful. And as I said before, the association resources are fantastic. So make sure that you make good use of those resources, and they're all there for you, and also there to direct other people too. So I think that's kind of my spiel really. So I'm hoping that now you've had a chance to think a little bit about it, that you might feel differently about working with people with MND. So we'd like to invite you again to have another word and put up your word for us to say how you might be feeling now. So would everybody be happy to do that? That's good. Reassuring. That's good. Motivated. I like that one. Energized, coming through there. More prepared. That's good. Better informed. More informed. Excited. I like that one. Excited. And as I say, this is not the only way to do it. There's lots and lots of good practice going on out there, and you find your own way. I think the more people that you see with MND, the more you find your own way, and the better you get as a professional at being able to support people with MND, and remembering that listening and giving people that space is the most crucial thing of all. And by listening to people, you give so much.
Someone saying here, Jen, interestingly, however we're feeling as professionals, we walk out to the door and the patient, family and carers live with it for 24 hours a day.
Oh, that's so true. Yeah, that's so true. And I think sometimes that's from when people do pass away, I think the gap in the lives of the carers and the family is absolutely enormous, because they have lived that experience of MND for that whole time. So then to go from that intense experience to absolutely nothing in terms of that carer role can be something that's really difficult for them to come to terms with. Got an empowered down the side there. That's good. And a brainwave. Someone's had a brainwave. I like that. Need more SLTs. Yes, we do. Let's fly the SLT flag. That's good. Okay, well, thank you to everybody who's contributed to the word clouds. It's really good to see.
Lots of thanks coming in for you, Jen.
Oh, that's great. Thank you, everybody, for listening.
So useful and practical tips. So that's really Interesting.
Fantastic.
Mm-hmm. One thing that did come up for you to have a think about, Jen, was someone saying about the sensitivity of introducing voice banking when people don't necessarily want to be thinking about losing that ability to communicate verbally.
Yeah. So that's a question that comes up a lot, actually. And I think when I first started working in voice banking, I had some discussions with my very early patients about whether it was okay to have that conversation with them. And actually, what everybody's very clearly said was yes, please, because actually, around that time of diagnosis, everything is so negative and so difficult that having something very positive to focus on can be such a breath of fresh air. And because it's something that's very practical, it gives you something to do, something that's going to benefit you in the future and has really, really positive outcomes as a result of doing it. So again, what I learned from those early patients was that if you introduce it to those patients as being a bit like an insurance policy for your voice, and that's something that I've stuck with for the years. So whilst you're acknowledging that they may lose their speech, we don't know whether everybody will lose their speech. We know that there's a very good chance that somebody will lose their speech, but we don't know for sure that they will. So putting it within that framework of an insurance policy for your voice is something that seems to go really well and really positively, allows people to be proactive and get on and do their recordings whilst they've got a good voice to do it, but isn't saying to them, that's the end of it, you're going to lose your speech. So hopefully that helps a little bit. Message banking is also really good to do. I've been doing a lot more message banking recently, and it complements the voice banking beautifully. So just in case anybody doesn't know the difference, with voice banking, you record a standard set of phrases, which is then turned into what we call a synthetic version of your voice. So it's like a computerized version of your voice, which you can then use on a communication aid to be able to generate any utterance that you want to generate. So the difference with message banking is that you directly record things that are probably a little bit more personal to you. So sometimes people will have "I love you." People seem to really like sarcastic phrases at the moment. That's one that really gets people's personality across, is some of those sarcastic phrases. And very often the family are better at recognizing those phrases that you say all the time, which you might not be as aware of yourself. So it's a good shared project, really, with family and friends to get a good list of phrases for message banking. You then record those messages just as individual files straight into your computer, and then should that person need to use a communication aid in future, those messages are programmed into that communication aid. And when they play that message, it comes out in their exact voice rather than a computerized version of the voice. So Richard as well will definitely advocate to you the use of voice banking and message banking as good complementary techniques for keeping that voice and preserving that voice for people.
People are saying how good that is, particularly about children. Someone's saying about recording their laughs as well.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. It's about keeping your identity as much as you possibly can do. And again, certainly something that came out in the very early days of voice banking for me was how important it was for children to be able to hear their mum, their dad, their grandma, whoever it is, voice come out of the communication aid, so that they don't ever forget what that person sounds like. So anything that you can capture that captures the individuality and the identity of that is just fantastic.
And a question, the software that you use, Jen, what would you say the software in terms that you're using for voice banking purposes?
So voice banking, you have to go with a commercial provider. So at the moment, my preferred ones tend to either be a cappella My Own Voice, which is the quickest one to do. So that can be really beneficial to people who are starting to lose speech, starting to fatigue a little bit more with their speech, because you only need to put 50 phrases as a minimum into a cappella My Own Voice. Speak Unique is another good one. You need about between 200 and 300 phrases with Speak Unique. They also have a voice repair element to their service. So if someone has started to have some changes to their speech, it's worth considering that voice repair element. Again, worth saying that the association will fund everybody to have their voice made, whichever provider you choose to use, and the information is out there on the association website and on RCSLT website to help you with making those decisions with people. For message banking, you can use any kind of recording device. At the moment, I'm just using the voice recorder on Windows, and that allows me just to type in what the message is and save it that way, so it's easy to see them. Because message banking is a little bit less structured, you could quite easily record a lot of messages and lose track of what you've done. So it's important to keep a really good list of which messages you've recorded. Some people have a little dictaphone, carry that around and record phrases. Anything that you've got to hand will usually be fine, and then it's converted. The files are converted into the right ones to use to be able to download them. And Richard's the techie expert on that. So if there's any more techie questions than that one, I'll refer you to Richard.
Asking about the cost of software. Is it free?
Software for
voice banking.
So you can record your voice free, and there's no cost that comes into it until you actually download the voice onto a device. So again, just going back to that insurance policy, you can record your voice, never need it. If you don't need it, no one pays for it. The commercial providers vary in terms of their costs from, I think, probably $50 is the cheapest one, right up to €2,000. But as I say, the association will fund anyone who has a diagnosis of MND who wants to download their voice once they need it. Message banking is free. You just sit and do your message banking yourself.
Someone's thinking about doing message banking within a cappella too. So when they do their voice banking. Sometimes I've done that with people. It depends on which provider you choose to use with the message banking. I think it's worth being aware that with a cappella, you've got to have your messages ready to go so that you record them before you actually do the voice banking. So it might depend on how the timing goes with that. But yes, certainly with a cappella, you can put custom phrases in, which is the equivalent of message banking. And you can also do that with Model Talker as well. I forgot what I was going to say then. Oh yes, some of the communication aids also have message banking functions built into them. So the Grid does, I think, and Predictable also does. For me, the issue with that is that you probably don't have that communication aid available at the point at which you want to be recording the message banking, but that function is there if anyone does happen to have that aid in place very early. People just sharing, in case people aren't following the chat, there's a possibility of banking voices in Welsh now through Bangor University.
Yes, I'd love to hear if anybody's done that. If there's anybody, I don't know if we've got anybody from Wales on today, but I'd love to hear.
I think Kath Owen might be able to speak to that. Kath, do you want to unmute and tell us a bit about it?
Hi, it's actually Jill. I'm a TI with the Speech and Language Therapy Service in Gwynedd, North Wales, and I have actually banked my voice in Welsh through this system. It's worked very well, and I'll be supporting one of our MND patients to bank his voice in the upcoming weeks as well.
Fantastic! Oh, thank you for sharing. That's great.
I'll pop a link up now with Stefano Galesi. He's one of the developers of this project, so I'll just email Kath whose laptop we're using, and then there'll be some contact details for anybody who's interested to get in touch with him there.
Fantastic. There are lots more languages coming through with voice banking now. A cappella offer quite a range of languages, and Speak Unique are looking at adding different languages this summer actually to the range of languages that they offer for voice banking. And part of that has been initiated by one of my patients who was on Sky News at the weekend, who's Icelandic. And yeah, we've done a lot of work message banking in both languages, but he's also now got lots of recording so that he'll be able to have a voice bank in Icelandic as well as in English in the summer when everything comes together. So really exciting.
So here, have you mentioned about people who already have quite severe dysarthria, and there is some voice repair service?
Yeah, so that's Speak Unique are the company that offer the voice repair service, and I think what's really critical, I think, to realise with voice banking is that whilst we might think that that patient's dysarthria is too severe to get a good outcome, actually for them it might be a good outcome if they voice bank. And Richard's recent research paper definitely covered some of that content. And I think sometimes people want to preserve anything that they've got of their voice. So whilst it might not feel like a good option to us as speech and language therapists to record a very dysarthric voice, sometimes for the individual it is still critical. Speak Unique's voice repair service, and I haven't had a lot of experience of it yet, but from what I have heard, it is getting some really good results in terms of that voice repair and just kind of cleaning up that data a little, I guess, to make sure that it's people can be understood when they have had that recording, just to make it a little bit clearer for them. So it's, again, worth exploring. And all of the companies are great at having discussions about individual people and what might help them. So Speak Unique are very approachable. If anyone was in a situation where they felt like they wanted to know whether that person would benefit from a voice repair, then I would certainly encourage you to talk to Speak Unique, and they're a great company, very helpful.
Excellent. Just sharing in the chat there the links to the equipment loan forms for the association, our support grant forms too, and the link's gone up for the Welsh voice banking opportunity there as well.
Fantastic. The communication aid pathway is really helpful as well on the association website. And there's lots of information and lots of resource in there.
Yeah, that's been shared, and all the links will come out afterwards, everybody, so don't panic about scribbling things down too much. We'll send it on in an email afterwards. Okay, there's no more questions coming up, Jen.
Okay, stunned everybody into silence, have we?
lots of thanks going up about it being a pragmatic presentation and not overly complicated and easy to follow. So
that's good.
Positive stuff coming out for you.
I'm always happy to chat. If anybody ever feels like they've got a burning question, then yeah, please do drop me an email, or I'm also on Twitter. So always happy to support and help if I can do. And I really hope that you've got something out of today, even perhaps for people with more experience. It just gives you an opportunity to be able to reflect. And I think sometimes we all just need to stop and reflect and have that time. So that's great.
Yeah. Lots and lots of thanks coming in. Great.
Brilliant.
So thanks for everyone for coming, really. It's been really great, the interest you're taking. It'd be really useful for us if you could have a look at the evaluation so that we can understand how we can make these sessions as good as this one or better. So we're always looking to improve. So yeah, if you could take time to do that, that'd be great. As I said, a recording will be available afterwards, so you can rewatch, and the links will be sent out to you. Anything that's been posted in the chat. That's great. Thank you very much, everybody.